Hello everyone, today I'm going to save you from a life of drudgery and boredom by showing you what you could be driving instead of your $16K, $20,000 hatch, sedan, saloon, whatever it is. So first of all, really briefly, talk about what's actually wrong with modern cars like this, which are actually in most ways really good. Secondly, have a look at what's on the market that you could buy right now for that price, which is still usable and practical, but which will be more interesting. And we'll start with the less radical options and then move on to some more oddball choices. Okay, so what's wrong with an M135i, for example, and these modern cars? Absolutely nothing. In many, many ways, they're actually much better than the cars I'm going to be showing you, probably in most ways. But for me, and I think maybe for a lot of you as well, they're just like dreadfully boring. And what's wrong with this particular car? It's fast, it sounds great, it's pretty parsimonious on fuel, it's practical, it's the most interesting of all the modern hotch hatches that you can get. Everything else is either four-wheel drive, four-pot, etc. This is as good as it gets, and yet it's still boring. You know why? Because the steering is just dead. There's just, you know, driving it, it's really good at everything it does. It's like a mini GT. But there are cars that are so much more interesting, and life is just too short to amble around in something like this. Let's see what else we can get instead. Right, let's go to the man cave and do some research. Okay, so when I started this, the first thing I did was to post on Facebook and see what my friends thought about suitable ideas for something to replace the little BMW, and there were some interesting suggestions, some sensible, some predictable, and then there were some more off-the-wall ones. Anyway, let's have a look, starting with this Porsche Panamera for £17,000. You can't argue this isn't a practical car. It is totally practical. True, it does look like a complete pig. They are just ugly. But apparently, they are amazingly good. I've never driven one. If you have a family, you can do that. And all for the same price as that BMW hatch. It's going to be as practical, probably more comfortable, even faster. You know, it is a Porsche. It will cost more to maintain and so on. But it's certainly an interesting option for that kind of money. This one is a 3-litre turbo diesel. So road tax is going to be relatively low as well to 2012. Don't know, you know, it's certainly an option that you should think about. Next in line is a Subaru BRZ. I wasn't sure whether to include these, but ultimately, super sensible car, cheap to run, made to be good and interesting to drive. It hasn't got any weird stuff like sort of variable rate steering or anything like that. It's not a ball of fire, but it will be fun, practical, maybe to a degree. It's certainly usable day in, day out without any issues, but obviously it doesn't have a lot of room. Next, this is quite a strong contender, an Audi RS4. This was posted by one of my mates. I absolutely love that colour. They're probably pretty optimistic with that price, to be honest, but it does look great. These look good. I've always loved them. The engine is mental, and this is really when Audi first took the fight properly to BMW with their M series. Before that, fast Audis were just, they were fast, but they just weren't right. And this kind of brought everything to the package. Weirdly, one of the reasons why I would dismiss this is, although aesthetically it's aged really well, the engines are great, apart from the decoking and a couple of other issues. But for me, the interior, I don't know what it is. It's aged really badly, and I just wouldn't, I don't know. I just wouldn't want to be one. Super practical, not expensive, although probably expensive-ish to run. Not the cheapest, certainly. The next one, really interesting. It's a Honda Integra Type R. 86,000 miles. It's a 1.8 litre. It's the VTEC engine. These are real screamers of little cars. They are amazing little things. It's not, this is a Japanese import. I'm always a bit weary of those. They usually claim they have 50 to 60,000 miles. Every single one, this one's 86, every single one that's imported. I think it's a national sport to clock these cars. You usually get some sort of interior or exterior additions that are less than tasteful as well. There's no pictures of the interiors on this car. It'd be massively exciting. I think you could use this day to day. Probably one of the best front wheel drive cars ever. Next, a little bit more of an oddball, but interesting, cheap. This one, you know, you can get a good Saab 900 Turbo for about 7 grand. Again, this one I think is a little bit optimistic in price. It's from a dealer. There's something quite cool about them. They're not amazing to drive, but they're alright. The way the engine's positioned means that they have equal length drive shafts, so the torque steer from a front drive car isn't as bad as you'd think. And there's just something quite cool about that link up with Saab. Saab obviously was also, I think still is actually, an aeroplane maker, so there's some influences in the car. Things that make it quirky and interesting. You won't get bored. They're pretty reliable. I reckon, as well, for the money, you wouldn't worry too much about leaving it around or using it day to day, even if it did deteriorate to some extent. Next one is a car that I have always wanted. This is not maybe the best example. It's 9 grand. It's on Europe. Says showroom condition. Part X welcome. So although it doesn't say so, I presume it's a trader. These attract interesting owners, so you've got to be a bit careful with them. But I don't know, they just look so right. You know, they just look really good. This one's got like aftermarket alloys, which although they look alright, these BBSs or BBS copies, whatever they are, I'd rather have the originals if I had this car. Different opinions on whether they're actually any good to drive or not. I heard the steering's a bit dead, but pretty iconic little car. Should be practical, although rust does get to them absolutely everywhere, so you'd be a bit worried about using it day to day, but it's certainly a possibility. Going still down the BMW route, what about an E28? Yeah, in my mind, these are just really cool cars. They're sort of reaching that era, they're into their own. They overlapped a bit with the E30. Because cars have grown so much nowadays, it's hardly bigger than a 3 Series, and it's just a cool, interesting car. This is a 528 as well, so the good engine. It's a manual. You can't really tell from the pictures. Actually, is it a manual? Limited slip diff. I assume it's a manual. You can certainly get manuals, and I wouldn't get an auto for this kind of money. So, interesting car. Some of the really more oddball stuff that in theory doesn't make any sense, but just hear me out. What about another suggestion from a mate? A used Bentley Turbo R, 1993. This one says 340 horsepower. I thought they had 400 odd. Either way, it's all about the torque with these, and what a machine. Look at it. Look at those. Oh, it's just so imposing. And it's just a big slab of a barn of a car. But look at that interior. And okay, so it's going to cost you a shitload in terms of bills and keeping it running and all the rest of it. But on the plus side, classic insurance for a car this old shouldn't cost very much. Road tax, £265 a year. So a tiny amount really, the same as my little Beamer, even though it obviously puts out shitloads more CO2 and so on. But that's one of the weirdnesses of the current legislation that we have. Look at that. Look at that Bentley engine. Look at that interior. I can't believe this car is the same price. It's actually cheaper than my BMW. Love that. And then, lastly, bit crazy. This particular car is on, I think the reserve is 8 grand. I spoke to the owners. Yeah, okay, initially it seems like a really mental thing to do, get one of these. But because of the age of this car, there's no road tax, there's no MOTs to worry about. And yeah, petrol consumption is going to be absolutely eye-watering, but I don't need to use my car day to day. I don't do that many miles. And yes, it's a complete old man's car as well, but maybe that's all right. I'm hardly like a whippersnapper. And in some ways, they're totally uncool, but in other ways, I just love to have one of these things, just like wafting around in a big old roller like this. Oh, and again, check it out. There's sometimes you look at it and you think that's hideous, and sometimes you look at it and think that's just that's such an amazing car. And again, those interiors, I just want to have it for the interior. I can just imagine yourself wafting around in a big roller. Will it be reliable? God knows, but there you go. Anyway, I've given you some options. Some of them are more realistic than others. An RS4, certainly, you could run day to day. Probably be a bit more expensive to run than the BMW, but not that much more. If you start taking depreciation into account, I worked out that last year I spent £2,400 on that BMW to keep it running. That's including servicing, various costs, insurance, road tax, MOTs, and so on. So something like the RS4 probably won't depreciate very much, very little. And the Honda as well won't depreciate much. So, and the Saab certainly won't, neither will the BMWs. There are some trade-offs, but I reckon you can run these cars day to day and just get rid of your boring modern car. Now, what am I going to do? I am looking at some of these cars and there's a possibility I might be picking one of these. The Bentley and the Rolls, totally unlikely. Give me 200,000 views on the video and I promise you I will buy a roller or a Bentley like that, and then I can do a video on it and I will run it for a while. That's hugely unlikely, so I think I'm pretty safe there. Hey, thank you all loads for watching and keep an eye out for the next video.